On December 9, 1941, Dr. Heinrich Buerkle stood in a field hospital 30 kilometers west of Moscow, staring at a line of German soldiers waiting for surgery. They weren't bleeding. They had no bullet wounds, no shrapnel fragments embedded in flesh. Their injuries were something else entirely. Their feet and hands had turned black. The tissue was dead, frozen solid, and now beginning to rot. The temperature outside was negative 35 degrees Celsius. Inside the unheated barn that served as the hospital, it was barely warmer. Buerkle had performed 8 amputations that morning. It was not yet noon. He would perform 14 more before darkness made surgery impossible. The next day would be worse. The day after that, worse still. By the end of December, his hospital alone would process over 300 frostbite cases requiring amputation. Most would lose multiple limbs. This was not an isolated medical crisis. Across the entire Eastern Front, from Leningrad to Rostov, German military hospitals were overwhelmed with frostbite casualties. The official Wehrmacht medical records documented the scale with bureaucratic precision. During the winter of 1941 to 42, approximately 90,000 German soldiers suffered frostbite severe enough to require amputation. That number exceeded the total of all German combat amputations from battle wounds during the same period. The German army was losing more soldiers to cold than to Soviet bullets and artillery combined. This was not supposed to happen. Germany had invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941 with the expectation of victory before winter arrived. Operation Barbarossa was planned as a 3 to 4 month campaign. Destroy the Red Army in a series of massive encirclement battles. Capture Moscow. Force Soviet surrender before the first snowfall. No extensive winter preparations were necessary because German forces would not be fighting in winter. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The planning assumptions were not irrational given the information available in early 1941. German intelligence estimated Soviet military strength at approximately 200 divisions. German forces would deploy 152 divisions for the invasion, achieving local superiority at key points through superior tactics, training, and equipment. Previous campaigns had demonstrated German military efficiency. Poland fell in 5 weeks. France fell in 6 weeks. Yugoslavia collapsed in 11 days. Greece fell in 3 weeks. The Wehrmacht appeared capable of defeating any opponent through rapid, decisive offensive operations. Soviet military performance in the Winter War against Finland from 1939 to 40 had reinforced German confidence. The Red Army had deployed over 1 million soldiers against Finland. Finnish forces numbered approximately 300,000. Yet the Finns inflicted catastrophic casualties on Soviet forces, killing or wounding over 326,000 Soviet soldiers, while losing approximately 70,000 themselves. German military analysts concluded that Soviet military capability was vastly overestimated. Poor leadership, inadequate training, and Stalin's purges of the officer corps in 1937 and 38 had crippled Red Army effectiveness. A German offensive would overwhelm Soviet defenses quickly, capturing or destroying Soviet forces before they could organize effective resistance. Therefore, the campaign would succeed rapidly, and winter would be irrelevant. These assumptions collapsed within weeks of the invasion. Soviet resistance was fierce and sustained. Red Army units that were encircled fought to destruction rather than surrendering quickly. Soviet forces traded space for time, falling back hundreds of kilometers while destroying infrastructure and supplies behind them. The scorched earth policy left German forces advancing through territory stripped of food, fuel, and shelter. Supply lines stretched across distances German logistics could not support. By September 1941, German armies were deep inside Soviet territory, but the Red Army had not been destroyed. Soviet forces continued fighting. Moscow had not fallen. The campaign that was supposed to end before winter was still ongoing as temperatures dropped and the first snow fell in October. German soldiers were still wearing summer uniforms. Winter clothing existed, It was sitting in warehouses in Germany and Poland, millions of winter coats, wool trousers, fur-lined boots, gloves, and cold weather gear. But there were insufficient trains and trucks to move it forward. German logistics prioritized ammunition and fuel. Food came second. Winter clothing came third or fourth or not at all. The decision made operational sense from a certain perspective. Armies cannot fight without ammunition. They cannot maneuver without fuel. Soldiers can endure discomfort if it means maintaining offensive capability. The assumption was that discomfort was temporary, that the offensive would succeed before cold weather became a serious problem. That assumption proved catastrophically wrong. The Wehrmacht had planned logistics for a short campaign over moderate distances. Operation Barbarossa became an extended campaign over vast distances. German supply capacity could not support it. The railway system in the Soviet Union used a different track gauge than German railways, requiring either conversion of the tracks or transshipment of supplies at transfer points. Both options were slow and inefficient. Conversion required specialized equipment and labor that were in short supply. Transshipment created bottlenecks where supplies accumulated faster than they could be moved forward. German trucks moved supplies from railheads to frontline units. But Soviet roads were primitive. The Rasputitsa, the autumn mud season, turned roads into impassable swamps in October and November. Trucks broke down from overuse. Spare parts were unavailable. German industry had prioritized tank and aircraft production. Truck production was low, approximately 35,000 trucks per year, compared to American production of over 500,000 per year. Horses moved most German supplies. The Wehrmacht employed approximately 2.75 million horses during Operation Barbarossa, far more horses than tanks or other motor vehicles. These horses required fodder, water, and rest. Soviet scorched earth tactics destroyed fodder supplies. Horses died by the tens of thousands from overwork, starvation, and cold. By December 1941, the German army had lost approximately 180,000 horses on the Eastern Front, approximately 1 in 15 of the total deployed. As horses died, supply capacity declined. As supply capacity declined, prioritization became more ruthless. Ammunition and fuel took absolute priority. Food was secondary. Winter clothing was tertiary at best. Individual soldiers made do with whatever they had. They wrapped newspapers around their feet inside boots for insulation. They stuffed straw into their uniforms. They took coats and boots from Soviet dead when possible. Though Soviet winter equipment was often in poor condition and ill-fitting. Some units attempted to improvise winter clothing from blankets and capture materials. Nothing was adequate. The cold was worse than most German soldiers had ever experienced. Temperature records from the winter of 1941 to 42 documented the severity. In late November, temperatures across the Central Soviet Union dropped to negative 20 degrees Celsius. In December, they fell to negative 30 to negative 35 degrees. In January 1942, temperatures in some areas reached negative 40 to negative 45 degrees. These are not brief cold snaps. These were sustained periods of extreme cold, lasting days or weeks. German soldiers had no experience with such conditions. Most came from Central or Western Europe, where winter temperatures rarely dropped below negative 10 degrees. They had no understanding of what negative 30 degrees felt like, or what it did to human tissue. Frostbite occurs when tissue freezes. Ice crystals form inside cells, rupturing cell membranes. Blood vessels constrict to preserve core body temperature, reducing blood flow to extremities. Without adequate blood flow, tissue dies. The process begins gradually. Initial symptoms include numbness and tingling in fingers, toes, ears, and nose. The skin turns pale, then grayish. At this stage, frostbite is reversible if the affected area is warmed gradually. German soldiers often failed to recognize these early symptoms or ignored them because stopping to warm frozen extremities meant falling behind their units or exposing themselves to enemy fire. As frostbite progresses, tissue turns hard and waxy. Sensation disappears completely. At this stage, frostbite is severe, but treatment might still save the tissue if medical care is available immediately. German soldiers often could not access medical care. Field hospitals were overwhelmed. Transportation was limited. Many soldiers continued fighting with frozen extremities because evacuation was impossible. The final stage occurs when frozen tissue thaws and dies. The affected area turns black or dark blue. Blisters form. The tissue begins to rot, producing a distinctive smell that German medical personnel quickly learned to recognize. Infection sets in rapidly. Gangrene develops. At this point, amputation is the only treatment. If amputation is not performed, infection spreads systemically and the patient dies of sepsis. Dr. Buerkle and thousands of other German medical officers faced this reality repeatedly throughout the winter. Soldiers arrived at field hospitals with blackened feet and hands. Some had walked for days on frozen feet, the tissue already dead, but the soldier still mobile. Others were carried by comrades who recognized that the injured soldier could no longer walk. The standard treatment was surgical amputation of the affected tissue. Anesthesia was often unavailable or in short supply. Many amputations were performed with minimal or no anesthesia, patients biting down on leather straps while surgeons removed dead tissue. The surgical conditions were primitive. Field hospitals operated in barns, schoolhouses, or any building with a roof. Heating was minimal. Sterilization was inadequate. Surgical instruments were washed and reused immediately. Infection rates were extremely high. Many patients survived the amputation only to die days later from post-operative infection. German medical records documented the progression of the crisis with meticulous detail. In November 1941, frostbite cases began appearing at field hospitals in significant numbers. By early December, frostbite admissions exceeded combat-wound admissions at many hospitals. By mid-December, the medical system was overwhelmed. Hospitals designed to handle 200 patients held 500 or more. Surgeons worked 20-hour shifts. Medical supplies ran short. Morphine, bandages, antiseptics, surgical instruments, everything was in inadequate supply. The Wehrmacht Medical Corps had planned for combat casualties, not for a mass casualty event involving tens of thousands of soldiers simultaneously. The scale of the disaster became clear when casualty reports reached higher headquarters in late December and early January. Army Group Center, the force attempting to capture Moscow, reported over 15,000 frostbite casualties in December alone. Army Group North reported similar numbers. Army Group South, operating in slightly warmer conditions, still reported thousands of cases. The numbers continued climbing through January and February 1942. By the time accurate accounting was possible in spring 1942, the total was approximately 90,000 soldiers with frostbite severe enough to require amputation. That figure included only cases requiring surgery. It did not include soldiers with mild frostbite who recovered without amputation, nor did it include soldiers who died before reaching medical facilities. The true total of frostbite casualties was likely between 150,000 and 200,000 soldiers. The comparison to combat casualties revealed the magnitude of the failure. During the same winter period, German forces on the Eastern Front suffered approximately 140,000 soldiers killed in action and approximately 330,000 wounded. Frostbite casualties requiring amputation were equivalent to approximately 2/3 of all killed in action and roughly 1/4 to 1/3 of all wounded. Put differently, for every 3 German soldiers killed by Soviet action, 2 were crippled by cold. The amputations destroyed combat effectiveness as thoroughly as death. A soldier who lost fingers could not operate a rifle. A soldier who lost toes or feet could not march. A soldier who lost hands could not perform any military function. These soldiers were permanently removed from combat duty, creating personnel gaps that had to be filled with replacements. But replacement soldiers required training, equipping, and transporting to the front, none of which could be accomplished quickly. The personnel crisis worsened throughout 1942. Germany was fighting on multiple fronts simultaneously. North Africa, the Eastern Front, occupation duties across Europe, and strategic defense against British bombing raids. Each front required soldiers. The loss of 90,000 soldiers to frostbite meant 90,000 fewer soldiers available for deployment. German military planners had anticipated casualties from combat. They had not anticipated losing an entire Army Corps equivalent to cold weather injuries. The individual stories behind the statistics revealed the human cost. Johann Schmidt, a lance corporal with the 3rd Panzer Division, kept a diary during the winter advance. His entries documented the progressive deterioration of his unit. November 15, 1941. Cold at night, but manageable during the day. We have greatcoats, but no winter clothing yet. Command says it will arrive soon. November 23rd. Snowing heavily. Temperature well below freezing. My feet are always cold. Several men have reported to the medical officer with frozen toes. December 1st. We have been fighting continuously for 2 weeks. No rest. No warm food. We sleep in the open because there are no buildings intact. My hands are swollen and painful. I can barely hold my rifle. December 7th. I can no longer feel my feet. The company commander ordered us to march 15 kilometers to new positions. I fell behind. A comrade helped me walk. The medical officer looked at my feet and shook his head. Schmidt's diary ended on December 8th. He was evacuated to a field hospital where surgeons amputated both feet below the ankle. He survived the surgery, but contracted infection and died on December 22, 1941. He was 23 years old. His story was repeated thousands of times across the front. Hans Müller, a private with the 296th Infantry Division, lost all fingers on both hands to frostbite in January 1942. He had been assigned guard duty overnight in an exposed position. Temperature was negative 38 degrees. He had no gloves. By morning, his fingers were frozen solid. He tried to warm them by holding them against his body, but the damage was already done. Surgeons at a field hospital amputated 8 fingers. They saved both thumbs, though with limited function. Müller was evacuated to Germany and spent months in recovery. He never returned to combat duty. Kurt Weber, a sergeant with the 12th Panzer Division, developed frostbite in both feet during the retreat from Moscow in December 1941. The temperature was negative 32 degrees. His unit was conducting a fighting withdrawal, moving several kilometers each day under Soviet pressure. Weber continued marching despite severe pain in his feet because stopping meant being captured. By the time his unit reached German lines and he could access medical care, the tissue in both feet was dead. Surgeons amputated both legs below the knee. Weber survived and was eventually fitted with prosthetics. He spent the remainder of the war in administrative positions in Germany, training new recruits and processing paperwork. He later wrote that he considered himself lucky. Many men with similar injuries died from infection or complications. The frostbite crisis was not evenly distributed across all German units. Infantry divisions suffered disproportionately because infantry soldiers spent more time exposed to the elements. Panzer divisions and motorized units had some access to vehicles that provided shelter, though vehicle heating was minimal and fuel shortages meant vehicles often stood idle with no heat. Artillery units suffered less than infantry because artillery positions could be fortified with some protection from wind. Rear echelon units suffered least because they operated farther from the front where some buildings remained intact for shelter. But even rear units experienced frostbite casualties. Truck drivers, supply personnel, and administrative staff working outdoors developed frozen extremities. The cold spared no one. The Wehrmacht High Command recognized the crisis by late December and attempted to respond. On December 25, 1941, Adolf Hitler issued orders prioritizing the delivery of winter clothing to frontline units. Trains were diverted from other purposes. Supply officers were ordered to expedite shipments. But the damage was already done. Tens of thousands of soldiers had already developed severe frostbite, and the logistical system could not suddenly increase capacity. The same trains, trucks, and horses that had been insufficient in November remained insufficient in December. Priority orders did not create additional transportation. Winter clothing began arriving at the front in January 1942, slowly and incompletely. Many units received partial shipments. A company might receive enough winter coats for half its strength, forcing commanders to decide which soldiers would receive adequate clothing. Some units received winter boots, but no wool socks. Others received gloves, but no coats. The piecemeal delivery meant soldiers remained inadequately equipped even as temperatures continued to drop. The clothing that did arrive was often inadequate for the conditions. German winter clothing had been designed for Central European winters, not Soviet winters. The standard greatcoat was wool, warm enough for Germany, but insufficient for negative 30-degree temperatures. The winter boots were leather with minimal insulation. They were not designed for soldiers who spent 12 to 18 hours per day standing or marching in snow. Soviet winter clothing, by contrast, was specifically designed for extreme cold. The Red Army issued felt boots called Valenki that provided excellent insulation. Soviet soldiers received quilted jackets and trousers that were warm even in extreme cold. Soviet gloves and hats covered more surface area and provided better protection. German soldiers who captured Soviet winter gear quickly learned its superiority. Many abandoned German equipment in favor of Soviet clothing despite regulations against wearing enemy uniforms. Officers often ignored these violations because they recognized that Soviet clothing kept soldiers effective in ways German clothing did not. The psychological impact of the frostbite epidemic was as significant as the physical impact. German soldiers had entered the Soviet Union confident of quick victory. They believed in German military superiority, German equipment, German tactics, German will. By December 1941, that confidence was shattered. Soldiers were not being defeated by Soviet military action. They were being defeated by cold, by inadequate logistics, by failures of planning and preparation. The realization spread through the ranks that German high command had sent them into winter combat unprepared. Trust in leadership declined. Morale collapsed in many units. Discipline problems increased as soldiers prioritized survival over military objectives. Some soldiers deliberately induced minor frostbite injuries to secure evacuation from the front, preferring the risk of amputation to continued combat in conditions they could not endure. German military police documented hundreds of suspected self-inflicted frostbite cases, though distinguishing self-inflicted injury from accident was often impossible. The Soviet winter offensive that began in December 1941 exploited German weakness ruthlessly. Soviet forces, equipped and prepared for winter operations, launched counterattacks along the entire front. German units, weakened by frostbite casualties and demoralized by the cold, often could not hold their positions. The Wehrmacht retreated for the first time in the war, abandoning territory captured at great cost. The retreat occurred in conditions that made orderly withdrawal nearly impossible. Roads were blocked by snow. Vehicles broke down from cold. Soldiers abandoned equipment they could no longer carry. Frostbite casualties multiplied because retreating soldiers were exposed to cold for extended periods without shelter. The Soviet winter offensive from December 1941 through March 1942 pushed German forces back between 100 and 250 kilometers along much of the front. The retreat stabilized in spring as temperatures rose and both sides exhausted their offensive capability. But the damage was done. Germany had lost its best opportunity to defeat the Soviet Union quickly. The initiative had shifted to the Soviets, and the Wehrmacht had lost 90,000 soldiers to frostbite, casualties that would not be easily replaced. The frostbite epidemic was not unique to the winter of 1941 to 42. It recurred every winter of the war on the Eastern Front, though never again on the same scale. In winter 1942 to 43, German forces were better prepared with winter clothing distributed before the onset of cold weather. Frostbite casualties declined to approximately 25,000 cases requiring amputation, still a significant number, but much reduced from the previous winter. In winter 1943 to 44, frostbite casualties rose again to approximately 40,000 cases as German forces conducted fighting retreats across the Soviet Union. Soldiers on the move could not build adequate shelters. Exposure increased. Medical care deteriorated as the Wehrmacht's logistical situation worsened. By winter 1944 to 45, frostbite casualties exceeded 50,000 cases as German forces retreated toward Germany itself. The total across all winters of the Eastern Front exceeded 200,000 German soldiers who suffered frostbite severe enough to require amputation. That figure was comparable to the population of a mid-sized German city, all crippled by a preventable medical condition. The long-term consequences for Germany were profound. 200,000 soldiers with amputated limbs required ongoing medical care, prosthetics, disability pensions, and social support. Many could not return to their pre-war occupations. Farmers who lost feet could not work in fields. Craftsmen who lost fingers could not operate tools. Factory workers who lost hands could not perform manual labor. These men became permanent burdens on an economy already strained by total war. German medical facilities struggled to provide adequate care. Prosthetics were in short supply. The specialized facilities that manufactured artificial limbs could not produce sufficient numbers. Waiting lists stretched for months or years. Many amputees received no prosthetics at all, relying on crutches or wheelchairs for mobility. Rehabilitation programs were minimal. Physical therapy was largely unavailable. Amputees were expected to adapt on their own with little support. The social cost was equally severe. 200,000 men returned to German society visibly maimed, living reminders of military failure. Their presence undermined propaganda narratives of German invincibility. Families struggled to care for disabled veterans. Wives became caregivers. Children grew up with fathers who could not work or participate fully in family life. Communities faced the challenge of reintegrating thousands of disabled veterans into civilian society. Some veterans adapted successfully, finding new occupations and building productive lives. Many did not. Depression, alcoholism, and suicide rates were high among amputee veterans, though exact statistics were not systematically collected during the war. Post-war studies of German veterans documented elevated rates of psychological disorders among those who had suffered severe physical injuries, particularly amputations. The German government established disability pension programs for wounded veterans, but funding was inadequate and payments were often delayed. By late 1944 and into 45, as Germany's economy collapsed under Allied bombing and military defeats, disability payments became irregular or stopped entirely. Veterans who had lost limbs serving their country found themselves abandoned by that same country. The contrast with how other nations handled cold weather injuries was stark. The Soviet Union experienced frostbite casualties throughout the war, but at much lower rates than Germany despite Soviet forces operating in the same conditions. Soviet preparation, equipment, and doctrine minimized cold weather injuries. Soviet winter clothing was superior. Soviet logistics prioritized maintaining supply lines, even in winter. Soviet medical doctrine emphasized prevention through proper equipment and training. When frostbite cases did occur, Soviet medical facilities were better prepared to handle them. The Soviet system was not perfect. Soviet soldiers suffered from cold injuries throughout the war. But the Red Army never experienced a mass casualty event comparable to the German winter of 1941 to 42. Soviet frostbite casualties across the entire war were estimated at approximately 75,000 serious cases, less than half the German total despite the Red Army being larger and fighting in the same environment for 4 years. The United States Army, operating in Europe from 1944 onward, also faced winter conditions. The winter of 1944 to 45 was particularly severe. American forces fighting in the Ardennes during the Battle of the Bulge experienced temperatures as low as -25 degrees Celsius. American soldiers developed frostbite, with documented cases exceeding 15,000 during that winter. But American logistics ensured winter clothing reached troops before cold weather became critical. American doctrine emphasized cold weather injury prevention. Soldiers were trained to recognize early frostbite symptoms. Medical personnel were positioned close to frontline units. Treatment protocols were standardized and effective. American frostbite casualties, while significant, never approached the scale of German casualties despite American forces operating in similar conditions. The difference was preparation, logistics, and leadership. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The British Army also operated in winter conditions, particularly during the Italian campaign. British forces faced cold weather in the Apennine Mountains during winters of 1944 and 45. British cold weather casualties occurred, but remained manageable. British doctrine, like American, emphasized prevention and rapid treatment. British logistics, while strained at times, maintained adequate supply of winter clothing and equipment. The pattern was consistent across Allied forces. Proper preparation, adequate equipment, and effective logistics minimized cold weather casualties. German military leadership failed at all three levels. The failure was not inevitable. Germany possessed the industrial capacity to produce adequate winter clothing. German textile factories could have manufactured millions of winter coats, trousers, boots, and gloves. The equipment could have been stockpiled near the Soviet border before the invasion began. Transportation could have been allocated to move winter supplies forward before the autumn mud season made roads impassable. None of this happened because German planning assumed winter would be irrelevant. Franz Halder, chief of the German General Staff, wrote in his diary in August 1941 that the campaign would be decided before winter. Military quartermasters were ordered not to prioritize winter equipment because it would not be needed. Transportation was allocated to ammunition and fuel. Winter clothing remained in Germany because moving it forward seemed wasteful. These were not irrational decisions based on the assumptions that governed German planning. If Operation Barbarossa succeeded as planned, winter clothing would indeed be unnecessary. German soldiers would be occupying Soviet cities with heated buildings. The campaign would be over. The problem was that the assumptions were wrong, and by the time German leadership recognized this, it was too late to correct the error. The logistics system could not suddenly shift priorities and move millions of items of winter clothing across hundreds of kilometers in a matter of weeks. The institutional failure extended beyond logistics. German military doctrine emphasized offensive operations, tactical superiority, and force of will. Defensive operations, sustainment, and logistical planning received less attention. The German General Staff produced brilliant operational plans for rapid advances and encirclement battles. They produced inadequate plans for sustaining armies across vast distances in hostile environments. This doctrinal imbalance had succeeded in Poland and France, where distances were short and campaigns concluded quickly. It failed catastrophically in the Soviet Union, where distances were vast and the campaign did not conclude quickly. The Wehrmacht lacked the institutional culture to recognize and correct this failure rapidly. German military culture valued boldness and aggression. Caution and careful preparation were seen as evidence of weak will. Officers who raised concerns about logistics or sustainability risked being labeled defeatist. The result was a military organization that could plan and execute brilliant tactical operations, but could not sustain those operations logistically. The frostbite epidemic was the most visible manifestation of this failure, but it was not the only one. German forces also suffered from inadequate food supplies, leading to malnutrition and weakened immune systems. They suffered from inadequate fuel supplies, leading to immobilized tanks and vehicles. They suffered from inadequate ammunition supplies, leading to rationed artillery fire and constrained offensive operations. Frostbite casualties were simply the most dramatic and preventable consequence of systemic logistical failure. Dr. Heinrich Buerkle, the medical officer who had performed 22 amputations on December 9, 1941, survived the war. He returned to Germany in 1945 and resumed medical practice as a civilian physician. He rarely spoke about his experiences on the Eastern Front. When asked years later about the winter of 1941-42, he said only that it had been the worst period of his life. He had been trained as a surgeon to save lives and repair injuries. Instead, he had spent months amputating healthy young men's limbs because those limbs had frozen. He estimated that he personally performed over 800 amputations during that winter. Most of his patients survived the surgery. Many died, later from infection or complications. He did not keep count of the deaths. It was too painful. He carried the memory of those operations for the rest of his life. The smell of gangrenous tissue, the sound of men screaming despite inadequate anesthesia, the sight of piles of amputated limbs outside field hospitals waiting to be buried in frozen ground. Buerkle died in 1978 at age 73. His obituary mentioned his service as a Wehrmacht medical officer, but provided no details. The amputations were not discussed. Johann Schmidt's family received notification of his death in January 1942. The official letter stated that he had died of wounds received in combat. It did not mention that the wounds were frostbite or that he had died of post-operative infection following amputation. German military authorities deliberately obscured the true cause of death for many frostbite casualties. Families were told their sons or husbands had died in combat, which was technically accurate but concealed the preventable nature of the injuries. This practice served propaganda purposes, admitting that tens of thousands of German soldiers were being crippled or killed by cold weather would undermine public confidence in military leadership. It was better to maintain the fiction that all casualties resulted from combat against a determined enemy. The deception extended to official casualty statistics published during the war. Wehrmacht communiques reported killed in action, wounded in action, and missing in action. Frostbite casualties were categorized as wounded in action without distinguishing them from combat wounds. The German public had no way to know that a significant portion of reported casualties were cold weather injuries rather than battlefield trauma. The truth emerged after the war when military historians gained access to detailed Wehrmacht medical records. These records, preserved in various archives, documented the frostbite epidemic with bureaucratic precision. Hospital admission logs, surgical reports, medical supply requisitions, casualty statistics by unit and date all confirmed that approximately 90,000 German soldiers had suffered frostbite severe enough to require amputation during winter 1941-42. Post-war analysis revealed additional details that had been concealed during the conflict. Many soldiers who survived amputation and returned to Germany never fully recovered. Infection rates from the primitive surgical conditions were extremely high. Soldiers whose amputations appeared initially successful often developed complications months or years later. Bone infections, phantom limb pain, circulatory problems in remaining tissue, psychological trauma from the sudden loss of limbs, all contributed to long-term suffering. Studies of German veterans conducted in the 1950s and 60s found that amputees had significantly lower life expectancies than veterans who had not lost limbs. Many died young from complications related to their injuries. The frostbite epidemic also revealed fundamental flaws in German military medicine. Wehrmacht medical doctrine was designed for treating combat casualties, bullet wounds, shrapnel injuries, burns from explosions. Cold weather injuries required different treatment protocols. Frostbite needed gradual rewarming, careful monitoring for tissue death, aggressive prevention of infection. Wehrmacht medical personnel lacked training in these protocols. Many doctors had never treated severe frostbite before the winter of 1941-42. They learned through trial and error, making mistakes that cost soldiers their lives or limbs. Medical supplies were inadequate for the scale of the crisis. Antibiotics did not exist yet, Penicillin was still in experimental stages in 1941. Sulfa drugs were available, but in limited quantities. Most frostbite patients received no antibiotics. Infection was treated with drainage and debridement, removing dead tissue and hoping the body could fight off the infection naturally. Many patients could not. Surgical instruments were insufficient. A field hospital designed to support one division might have equipment for 10 simultaneous surgeries. During the frostbite epidemic, that same hospital might receive 100 patients requiring immediate surgery. Doctors reused instruments between patients with minimal sterilization. Cross-contamination was common. Infection spread from patient to patient. Hospital facilities were inadequate. Most field hospitals operated in unheated or minimally heated buildings. Patients recovering from surgery were exposed to cold that slowed healing. Some patients developed frostbite in their remaining extremities while recovering from amputations of other limbs. The absurdity of this situation, soldiers being treated for frostbite, developing additional frostbite during treatment, illustrated the complete breakdown of German logistics and planning. The psychological trauma inflicted on medical personnel was significant. Wehrmacht doctors and nurses had not signed up to amputate thousands of otherwise healthy young men. They had expected to treat combat injuries, which were tragic, but at least resulted from enemy action. Frostbite injuries resulted from German failure. Medical personnel understood this. They understood that with proper equipment and planning, the amputations they were performing would have been unnecessary. This knowledge created profound moral distress. Some medical officers broke down under the strain. Mental health records from Wehrmacht medical personnel documented elevated rates of depression, anxiety, and what would now be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder among doctors and nurses who served on the Eastern Front during winter 1941-42. The burden of performing preventable amputations, combined with the primitive conditions and inadequate supplies, exceeded what many medical personnel could psychologically tolerate. Some requested transfers. Some abandoned their posts. Most continued working despite the psychological cost because wounded soldiers needed treatment regardless of how those wounds occurred. The frostbite epidemic changed German military policy permanently. After the winter of 1941-42, Wehrmacht doctrine mandated winter preparation for all Eastern Front operations. Clothing stockpiles were established. Transportation priorities were adjusted. Medical personnel received training in cold weather injury treatment. Preventive measures were implemented. Soldiers were ordered to check their extremities regularly for early signs of frostbite. Units established warming stations where soldiers could briefly thaw frozen hands and feet. Field kitchens were prioritized to ensure soldiers received hot food and drinks. These measures reduced frostbite casualties in subsequent winters, but could not eliminate them entirely. Soldiers fighting in extreme cold would always be at risk. The key was minimizing that risk through proper equipment and procedures. German forces never again experienced a frostbite epidemic on the scale of winter 1941-42. But they also never again had the opportunity to win the war. The Wehrmacht's best chance for victory had been destroying the Red Army in 1941 before winter arrived. That opportunity was lost, in part because 90,000 soldiers were crippled by frostbite at the critical moment when German forces were attempting to capture Moscow. Those 90,000 soldiers represented combat power that could not be replaced. Each soldier lost to frostbite was one fewer rifle on the front line. Each artillery crew member lost to amputation meant one gun that could not fire effectively. Each tank crew member lost to frozen extremities meant one tank operating at reduced efficiency. Military effectiveness declined proportionally to frostbite casualties. The Wehrmacht did not simply lose 90,000 soldiers. It lost the military capability those soldiers represented at the precise moment when that capability was most needed. The timing could not have been worse. December 1941 was when German forces made their closest approach to Moscow. Infantry units were fighting in Moscow's suburbs. German reconnaissance elements could see the Kremlin towers through binoculars. A final push might have captured the city. But German forces were exhausted, undersupplied, and increasingly crippled by frostbite. Soviet counterattacks, launched by fresh divisions transferred from Siberia, pushed German forces back. German units, weakened by cold weather casualties, could not hold their positions. The opportunity to capture Moscow passed and never returned. Some military historians argue that capturing Moscow would not have ended the war. The Soviet government could have relocated to another city and continued fighting. This argument is probably correct. But capturing Moscow would have been a devastating psychological blow to the Soviet Union and a massive propaganda victory for Germany. It would have disrupted Soviet command and control. It would have damaged Soviet morale. The failure to capture Moscow, combined with the subsequent retreat, instead dealt a psychological blow to Germany. German soldiers and civilians had been told that victory was certain. The retreat from Moscow demonstrated that victory was not certain. German military leadership was fallible. The Wehrmacht could be defeated. Frostbite casualties contributed directly to that failure. The counterfactual question of what would have happened if German forces had been properly equipped for winter is impossible to answer definitively. Would properly equipped German forces have captured Moscow? Possibly. Would they have defeated the Soviet Union? Less likely. The Soviet Union had vast reserves of manpower, territory, and industrial capacity. Even with Moscow captured, the Soviet government could have continued the war from the Urals. American Lend-Lease aid was beginning to arrive. Soviet war production was increasing despite territorial losses. Germany probably could not have achieved outright victory over the Soviet Union regardless of winter clothing. But proper winter preparation would have prevented 90,000 casualties. Those soldiers could have continued fighting. German offensive capability would have been stronger. The Wehrmacht might have captured more territory, inflicted greater casualties on Soviet forces, and prolonged the war even if ultimate victory remained out of reach. The failure to provide winter clothing shortened the war by weakening German forces at a critical moment. In that sense, the frostbite epidemic was a self-inflicted wound that accelerated German defeat. The lesson was clear and remains clear today. Military operations require logistical support. Soldiers need proper equipment for the environment where they are fighting. Planning that assumes best-case scenarios while ignoring foreseeable risks will fail catastrophically when those risks materialize. These are not abstract principles. These are historical facts documented in the amputated limbs of 90,000 German soldiers who froze because their government sent them into winter combat without winter clothing. The Wehrmacht had the industrial capacity to produce the clothing. Germany had the textile factories, the materials, the skilled workers. What Germany lacked was the planning foresight and logistical competence to get that clothing to soldiers before they froze. The failure was not inevitable. It was the result of specific decisions made by specific people who assumed the war would be over before winter mattered. When those assumptions proved wrong, the consequences were catastrophic. 90,000 soldiers lost fingers, toes, hands, feet, or limbs. 200,000 more suffered serious frostbite across subsequent winters. These casualties were entirely preventable. They represented a failure of leadership, planning, and logistics on a scale rarely seen in military history. The human cost extended beyond the soldiers themselves. Families lost sons, husbands, and fathers not to heroic combat, but to administrative failure. German society absorbed 200,000 severely disabled veterans who required lifelong care and support. The economic burden persisted for decades after the war ended. The psychological burden persisted even longer. The frostbite epidemic demonstrated that modern warfare is as much about logistics as combat. An army that cannot supply its soldiers cannot sustain operations regardless of tactical brilliance or battlefield courage. The Wehrmacht possessed both tactical brilliance and battlefield courage. German soldiers fought with skill and determination in conditions that would have broken lesser forces. But skill and determination could not overcome systemic logistical failure. Frostbite Crippled 90,000 soldiers more effectively than Soviet bullets or artillery. The cold succeeded where the Red Army initially failed, stopping the German advance on Moscow and forcing a retreat that marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany's ambitions in the East. The comparison to other failures in military history is instructive. The French invasion of Russia in 1812 under Napoleon also suffered catastrophic cold weather casualties. French forces, like German forces 129 years later, invaded Russia in summer expecting quick victory. French forces, like German forces, were caught in Russian winter without adequate preparation. French forces suffered approximately 400,000 casualties during the retreat from Moscow, many from cold, starvation, and disease. Napoleon's Grande Armée was destroyed not primarily by Russian military action, but by the failure to sustain operations through winter. The parallel is exact. Military planners studied Napoleon's failure extensively. Numerous books and analyses documented the logistical breakdown that led to catastrophe. German general staff officers were educated in this history. They knew what had happened to Napoleon's army in Russia. Yet they repeated the same mistake. The Wehrmacht invaded the Soviet Union in summer expecting quick victory. The Wehrmacht was caught in Soviet winter without adequate preparation. The Wehrmacht suffered catastrophic cold weather casualties, 90,000 amputations in one winter alone. History repeated itself because military planners convinced themselves that their situation was different. German technology was superior to Napoleonic-era technology. German logistics were more advanced. German soldiers were better trained. German tactical doctrine was more sophisticated. All of this was true. None of it mattered because the fundamental problem remained the same. Russia is vast. Russian winter is harsh. Armies operating deep in Russian territory during winter need extensive logistical support. Neither Napoleon nor Hitler provided that support adequately. Both paid the price in soldiers who froze. The difference was that Hitler had the advantage of knowing Napoleon's failure and chose to ignore the lesson. German military intelligence had detailed information about Soviet winter conditions. Weather data from previous decades was available. Temperature records documented the severity of Soviet winters. German diplomats and military attachés who had served in Moscow knew what winter meant. This information was briefed to German planners. They chose to plan for a short campaign that would end before winter rather than a long campaign that would continue through winter. The choice reflected overconfidence in German military capability and underestimation of Soviet resilience. It was a fatal combination. The frostbite casualties were the price of that overconfidence. 90,000 soldiers paid with their limbs. Many more paid with their lives. Germany, as a nation, paid with a weakened army at the critical moment when maximum strength. German forces conducted successful tactical operations in 1942 and 43. They inflicted heavy casualties on Soviet forces. They captured additional territory. But the strategic initiative had shifted. The Wehrmacht was reacting to Soviet moves rather than dictating the course of operations. The frostbite epidemic of winter 1941 to 42 marked the turning point. After that winter, Germany was fighting for survival rather than for victory. The war continued for 3.5 more years. Millions more soldiers and civilians died. But the outcome was no longer in doubt. The side that had allowed 90,000 soldiers to lose limbs from frostbite due to planning failure and logistical incompetence could not defeat the combined forces of the Soviet Union, United States, and British Empire. The amputations performed in those freezing field hospitals in December 1941 were not just medical procedures. They were physical evidence of German defeat. Each severed limb represented a soldier who would never fight again, combat power permanently lost, a gap in the line that could not be filled. Multiply those individual losses by 90,000 and the strategic impact becomes clear. The Wehrmacht lost the equivalent of multiple divisions to preventable cold weather injuries. Those divisions could not be replaced. German manpower was finite. Soviet manpower, augmented by eventual American entry into the European War, was effectively unlimited. A war of attrition favored the Allies. Germany needed quick, decisive victory. The frostbite epidemic ensured that quick victory was impossible. Dr. Buerkle, performing amputations in that frozen barn west of Moscow, could not have known he was witnessing a turning point in the war. He was too busy trying to save lives and prevent infections with inadequate supplies and impossible conditions. But historians examining the records decades later could see clearly what he could not. Those amputations marked the moment when German victory became impossible and German defeat became inevitable. The cold had succeeded where Soviet armies initially failed. It had stopped the Wehrmacht, inflicted catastrophic casualties, and shattered the illusion of German invincibility. The soldiers who lost limbs to frostbite paid the price for their leaders' failures. They deserved better. They deserved winter clothing, adequate supplies, and planning that took obvious risks seriously. Instead, they received greatcoats designed for German winters, boots that were insufficient for Soviet cold, and orders to continue advancing regardless of conditions. When their fingers and toes froze, when gangrene set in, when surgeons amputated blackened limbs, the responsibility lay with military leadership that had chosen to ignore foreseeable risks. The amputees returned to Germany throughout 1942 and subsequent years. They returned to families who had believed victory was certain. They returned to communities that were shocked by the visible evidence of failure. A man with no legs or a man with no hands was undeniable proof that something had gone terribly wrong. Propaganda could not conceal these casualties. They were living reminders that Germany was not invincible, that German planning was not perfect, that German soldiers were suffering defeats. The psychological impact on German society was significant, though difficult to quantify. The amputees themselves faced difficult futures. Many struggled with depression and feelings of worthlessness. They had been trained as soldiers, as fighters. Their identity was built around physical capability. Amputation destroyed that identity. They were no longer soldiers. They were invalids, dependent on others, unable to perform the functions that had defined their lives. Rehabilitation was minimal. Psychological support was nearly non-existent. Veterans were expected to cope on their own, to maintain the stoic soldier mentality even though their soldiering days were over. Some adapted successfully. Others did not. Suicide rates among severely wounded veterans were elevated, though exact statistics are unavailable because the Nazi government did not want to acknowledge the problem. The families of amputees also struggled. A wife whose husband returned with no legs faced a transformed life. She became primary breadwinner, caregiver, and emotional support for a traumatized man. Children grew up in households marked by disability and often by poverty because disabled veterans could not work. These were not rare situations affecting a few families. 90,000 men with major amputations from winter 1941 to 42, plus tens of thousands more from subsequent winters, meant hundreds of thousands of family members whose lives were permanently altered by frostbite casualties. The social cost compounded over time. Germany's economy struggled to absorb these disabled veterans. Jobs were scarce. Disabled workers were less productive than able-bodied workers. Employers preferred hiring workers who could perform full range of physical tasks. Disabled veterans often could not find employment. They depended on inadequate disability pensions that became increasingly worthless as Germany's economy collapsed in the final years of the war. By 1945, many amputee veterans were destitute, dependent on charity or family support to survive. The post-war period brought little improvement. Germany was devastated, its cities bombed, its infrastructure destroyed, its economy in ruins. Disabled veterans competed for scarce resources with millions of other Germans who were also struggling to survive. Allied occupation authorities provided some assistance, but priorities lay elsewhere. Rebuilding took precedence over supporting disabled German veterans. Many amputees lived in poverty for years after the war ended. The contrast with how Allied nations treated their disabled veterans was stark. The United States established comprehensive veterans' healthcare systems. Disabled American veterans received prosthetics, rehabilitation, job training, and ongoing medical care. The GI Bill provided educational opportunities. Disabled veterans were not left to fend for themselves. Similar programs existed in Britain and other Allied nations. The difference in treatment reflected differences in resources and priorities. Allied nations had won the war. They had functioning economies. They could afford to care for their veterans. Germany had lost the war. Its economy was destroyed. Resources did not exist to adequately care for disabled veterans. The amputees who had frozen in winter 1941 paid twice. Once when they lost their limbs, and again when their country could not or would not provide adequate support afterward. This was the final tragedy of the frostbite epidemic. The soldiers had suffered preventable injuries due to leadership failure. Then they suffered abandonment due to national collapse. Their sacrifice had been in service of a regime that started a war of aggression and committed atrocities across Europe. That fact complicated how their suffering should be understood. The Nazi government that sent them into Soviet winter without proper clothing was responsible for genocide, slavery, and crimes against humanity. German soldiers on the Eastern Front participated in or witnessed war crimes. Some were perpetrators. Many were complicit. Yet the individual soldiers who froze were also victims of their own leadership's incompetence. These two realities coexist uncomfortably. The Wehrmacht's crimes do not erase the suffering of soldiers who lost limbs. The soldiers' suffering does not excuse the Wehrmacht's crimes. Both facts are true simultaneously. The frostbite epidemic can be understood as a logistical failure with tragic human consequences, while also acknowledging that the campaign causing those casualties was a war of aggression aimed at enslaving entire populations. Historical understanding requires holding both truths. The 90,000 German soldiers who lost limbs to frostbite in winter 1941-42 were failed by their leadership. They deserved better planning, better equipment, better support. They also were fighting for a cause that history rightfully condemns. Their suffering was real. The cause they served was evil. These are not contradictory statements. The lesson for military planners remains valid regardless of the war's moral context. Soldiers need proper equipment for the environment where they operate. Logistics matter as much as tactics. Planning that ignores foreseeable risks will fail. Leadership that sends soldiers into battle without adequate support is responsible for the consequences. These principles apply regardless of whether the war is just or unjust. The Wehrmacht's failure to provide winter clothing was a military and moral failure. Military because it crippled combat effectiveness. Moral because leadership had a duty to provide soldiers with tools necessary to survive and function. That duty existed even though the war itself was unjust. The distinction matters because modern militaries must learn from historical failures without endorsing historical causes. The frostbite epidemic teaches important lessons about logistics, planning, and leadership. Learning those lessons does not require sympathy for Nazi Germany. It requires clear-eyed analysis of what went wrong and why. What went wrong was simple. German leadership planned for a short campaign and ignored the possibility of winter operations. When winter arrived anyway, soldiers pay the price. 90,000 men lost fingers, toes, hands, feet, or entire limbs because winter clothing remained in German warehouses instead of being issued to frontline troops. The failure was preventable, foreseeable, and catastrophic. The lesson is equally simple. Prepare for the environment where you will operate. Assume worst-case scenarios rather than best-case scenarios. Prioritize soldier welfare alongside operational objectives. Logistics are as important as firepower. Supply chains must function or armies will fail. These lessons were learned at the cost of 90,000 German soldiers' limbs in one winter alone. The price was unconscionable. The lessons remain valid. Modern militaries still face similar challenges. Operations in extreme environments require specialized equipment and extensive logistical support. Cold weather operations, desert operations, mountain operations, jungle operations, each environment presents unique challenges. Proper preparation is essential. Improvisation cannot compensate for inadequate planning. The Wehrmacht tried to improvise its way through Soviet winter. The result was 90,000 amputations. Modern militaries that ignore environmental challenges risk similar failures. The scale might differ. The fundamental problem remains. Soldiers cannot fight effectively if they cannot survive the environment. Survival requires proper equipment, adequate supplies, and logistical systems capable of delivering both. These are not optional luxuries. These are operational necessities. The Wehrmacht learned this lesson too late. The soldiers who froze in winter 1941 paid the tuition for that education. Their amputated limbs served as a warning that apparently still needs repeating. Plan ahead. Prepare thoroughly. Take environmental risks seriously. Support your soldiers, or watch them freeze and fail. The choice is that stark. The evidence is that clear. 90,000 German soldiers lost limbs because their leaders chose poorly. That number alone should ensure the lesson is never forgotten. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.